It's truly a delight to be able to connect to you like this, when we hold special discussions and broadcasts. And this SWAM course on soft skills is truly, helping our students. And I hope you are going through the study material, you are listening to all the programs that we are having. In today's broadcast, in this discussion, we will have a wide-ranging discussion as to what is communication, what is non-verbal communication to be specific, what are the various perspectives that we can have, various ideas associated with what industry expects from you, and how we can benefit from this understanding at the personal level and at the organizational level. I'm so happy that you are responding to our course, and then there's this connectivity that we have been able to establish, where you ask questions and we respond to that. Is very encouraging. So yes, let's initiate today's discussion as to what is communication and non-verbal communication, to be specific. You see, we live in an age of communication. You see, if you look at the uh, man's evolution from the cave dwelling days, then we know the agrarian days, and then pre-industrial and industrial days, post-industrialist. In 21st century, people often point out that we live in an age of communication gadgets, but the communication levels are going down. If you read many communication theorists, they often pointed out that it is being compromised. So yes, it is important that we understand how does human actions lead to more communicative framework. So yes, verbal communication, we all understand that when we speak, when we use the right word, when we speak up, when we through a verbal power, we connect to this world and influence the functioning of this world. But then, if you look at the data, the statistics, the hard fact, they say that verbal communication and its scope is very limited. About 10% or maybe less than that is attributed to verbal communication. In fact, non-verbal communication holds the edge. It assumes more than 50% of you transact through non-verbal communication. Let's try to understand as to what is non-verbal communication. Now, it comprises the actions or attributes of people, including appearance, movement, sound, time, smell, and space that possesses socially shared meaning and which stimulate understanding without relying on words. So yes, my mouth, my power to speak is of course important, but what is besides that, in terms of my expression, my gestures, my the way I stand, the way I sit, the way I respond to others, that is in more significant. I think because these things operate and found to be significant because they can announce our emotions, expectations, and attitude instantly and often more powerfully than spoken or written language. So like that, I think is about everyday presence. We have studies showing 7%, in fact 7% of this, when I was telling you previously 10%. So the exact is 7%, where body language and paralanguage account for this overwhelming majority that guides our daily interaction. So once we get our this understanding right, that what we speak is important, but we don't speak is equally important or more important. So as a result, I think we need to kind of decode, understand, analyze postures and facial expressions, eye gaze, vocal tone, and responding to thousands of silent signals, I would say, that shape our relationship before any sentence is completed. So this is important that we understand. Let's go to understanding of relative weight of verbal and non-verbal cues. Like we have if you look at the statistical emphasis, researchers have pointed out in this domain that more than 50% of meaning is carried out, communicated by non-verbal cues, and 38% by vocal qualities, leaving words themselves with a modest share of communicative impact. That is something that we need to keep in our minds all the time, because then that will determine our level of communication. Implications of honesty perception: when spoken content conflicts with physical signals, audiences usually conclude that the verbal message is deceptive, since body language is an unconscious broadcast of genuine feeling. I may add to this that professional credibility depends on aligning gestures, postures, and tone so that they reinforce rather than contradict and the statements being made. You must have no heard about this, that your eyes are your index of your mind. If your words and your eyes don't stand in harmony, if there's no match, then you'll not be able to connect to your audience, you'll not be able to communicate the desired message. So yes, this harmony, this synthesis, this sense of equilibrium, the balance has to take place as far as your postures, gestures, and tone is concerned. So like that, if you look at what are the core functions, there's this something very significant. How do we use non-verbal messages? Like, non-verbal messages can repeat, emphasize, or underline a verbal statement. For example, pounding, when sometimes you must have seen people pound a table and showing urgency, or patting an employee's back while praising their effort. That is important. So like, how closely you understand these things. If you complement that with your verbal thing, that will be important. So how does that that reinforcement increases our clarity, strengthens persuasive power, and ensures that the important information remains memorable for listeners long after the meeting is over, long after that event. So this non-verbal communication, gestures, postures, tone, that helps you to carry it for longer period. Yeah. So like contradiction and substitution, for example, body language may negate spoken content, signaling sarcasm or insincerity when facial expressions conflict with declarations, urging recipients to doubt the literal text. In other instances, for example, gestures, eye contact, or silence substitute entirely for speech, conveying approval, disapproval, or authority, where words would be slow or unnecessary. I'm basically, when we are discussing the significance of interpersonal interpretation, I'm saying that relation building is something that comes in very handy through this. And the non-verbal signals people put at ease. Sometimes, if you kind of express a sense of peace and equanimity and calmness, people will have an understanding of a sense of faith, trust, and that will draw others towards us, and they'll project like openness, confidence, respect, and at the same time that will help us to nurture a productive collaboration. So like, otherwise, for example, if you don't do that, the other side of this will happen, and like careless posturing, restless movement, if there is no harmony between what you say and the way your eyes and hands are moving, then that can averted eyes, for example, offend people, confuse people, or undermine a sense of rapport that you may be trying to establish. So even if the even if you are speaking something polite, even if you are conveying something very humble, like if there is no harmony with non-verbal cues, that will be a problem. So but if you have to take it forward and further emphasize its significance, it's about persistence beyond speech. Communication does not cease when talking stops. Posture, facial tension, and eye focus continue transmitting attitudes that either sustain engagement or generate tension. So, by learning to monitor these residual signals, professionals can maintain positive atmosphere, like during when we have in the course of a discussion pauses, negotiations, and listening phases of our interaction. So, like, I hope you are with us on this point, that body language overview, which is called kinesics, that is important. Where how do we understand this? The study of body movements that carry meaning, ranging from expansive gestures to subtle shifts in stance, many of which occur involuntarily yet reveal emotional states. So, emotions such as anger, happiness, sadness, or restless, these get manifested more vividly through our bodily actions, or or less through vocabulary, making this thing, kinesics, a prime indicator of genuine sentiment. I mean, if we understand it in the context of cultural interpretation, both the listener and the speaker, receiver and the sender, they decode body language within a shared cultural context. So, identical movements can be interpreted differently across societies, demanding sensitivity during cross-cultural encounters. So, we need to be very aware that, like, sometimes in one particular, a gesture in one given situation, in one cultural geographical situation, that will may mean something else. Like, in Japan, for example, you will have people like, bowing down and then speaking less, and like, so if we need to orient ourselves into how people operate at the social level, at the in a public sense, and then we can have those, the non-verbal communicative patterns. If we go to the, like, facial expressions, as they call it, like, laughter is the universal language. One can always look at the face, and without him or her telling anything, one can make out whether it is a pleasant situation, or something, which may call for some, like, urgent remedy. Like, so emotional transparency, for example, human face is the most expressive body part, which will reveal happiness, sadness, anger, surprise, fear, and disgust, universally transcending, like, even if we have about more than 8,000 languages, so linguistic or regional barriers. So, like, we can, like, look at how, facial expressions, we need to work on that a bit more. So, what is its role in accurate response? Our ability to read nuanced facial cues, such as micro smiles or furrowed brows, that helps us to determine whether we provide empathy, assistance, or caution, thus influencing a relational outcome. Like, so, if you are not aware of it, if you are not alert about it, that may lead to a misreading or ignoring, that information, which may risk, like, kind of inappropriate reactions that may damage our trust, whereas accurate decoding enables supportive and kind of appropriate context behavior. Like, we need to be very particular in our understanding. So, I hope you are coming to terms with this understanding of how non-verbal communication, gives you the edge, and how we need to be all the time aware, like, for example, gestures and deliberate signals. Like, you'll find that waving, pointing, and finger counting supply a direct and often animated layer of meaning that can illustrate qualities which are, like, sometimes, through words it is difficult. So, like, directions or highlight argument points, so many gestures are automatic accompaniment to speech, while others are are very deliberate, such as raising a hand in the debate to claim a turn, or like each adding nuance to verbal delivery. As far as cultural sensitivity is concerned, we can always look at, a sign may, I mean, like, one sign may praise in one culture and yet offend in another instance. So the okay hand shape is positive in English speaking countries, but potentially rude at some places too. So speakers, must adjust like bodily vocabulary to audience norms. You must have seen that, whenever facial tones or gesture content clash, recipients detect mixed messages and question sincerity, underscoring the need for congruent physical and spoken communication. This is something that we need to work on, and we need to, you'll find that, the people like who are good at using nonverbal communication, they will succeed more in their personal lives and in their professional lives, and even in politics, for example. Sometimes, they use their body language, and they communicate so much hope and faith and trust among their audience, because they carry themselves in such a manner that when once you look into their eyes, some of our political friends, you will have a sense of, warmth and peace and equanimity, calmness, and that composure. So that is something that we need to understand. So what do we take up take from posture and movement? For example, like, erect yet relaxed posture, dynamic gestures, and steady eye alignment project authority and confidence, whereas slumped shoulders and visible tension convey insecurity or disengagement. That is something that, like, I mean, all listeners, all audience people, they instinctively associate upright bearing with competence, making mindful stance control essential for credible presentations and leadership roles. So this is something I think you'll take this with you, that how we need to um, handle, deal with postures in your, like, sit steady, and how will align your eyes, and like so message constituency. You will see that, subtle movements such as leaning forward, crossing arms, or shifting weight, that would signal interest, defensiveness, or impatience, and their alignment with verbal content ensures coherent interaction. So this is something that we need to be very much aware of and alert about. And if we are able to put that in a behavioral pattern, if we are able to practice that stable postures, and that will help us to encourage approachability, a sense of, honest dialogue will get promoted, and reducing the likelihood of any communication gap, any misinterpretation, or any intimidation. This is something that will help us to boost our communicative pattern at the non-verbal level. What is eye gaze and contact now? Let's try to measure that. When we talk about eye contact, I am saying that, which what regulates communication flow, demonstrates, it effectively displays our attentiveness, and communicates emotions ranging from attraction to hostility, making it central to reality dynamics. Steady gaze often implies honesty and engagement, whereas shifty or downcast eyes are frequently judged as signs of, like, less than honest, or deception, or unease, or a sense of submissiveness also at the same time. I think we need to kind of balance these in a cultural context, where, sustained eye contact sometimes, suggests respect in many Western contexts. But if you look at in the Eastern sense, some cultures, consider prolonged staring very, very, difficult and intrusive. Successful communicators, therefore, they know how to calibrate gaze during their handling of this will vary from one situation to another. Sometimes you have to just keep looking at your audience. Sometimes you can be little flexible and very experimental about that. So yes, um, and monitoring the listeners eyes responses, no, I think that will also help us to gauge a comprehension and adjust explanations, reinforcing the interactive clarity. So that's something that I would like to emphasize. And then we would like to go to appearance and first impressions. No, what is like visual self presentation? My dear students, you will be happy to understand this, that when we are talking about visual self presentation, we mean clothing, grooming, color choice, accessories, no, which like come under non-verbal cues that signal personality traits, professionalism, and respect for the context before any dialogue begins. So one has to study the situation, the environment, the landscape, the cultural thing, and then one has to in terms of clothing and color choice and other accessories that we may use, that has to be determined. So neat, a task appropriate dress supports a positive impression. So like you whether like where if you, on the other hand, if you are untidy, that may undermine authority and distract audiences from um, supplying substantive messages. So like that, you need to be very alert about this. And like if we go and talk about physical attributes and beyond, like you'll find like if I give an example, like the innate features such as height or complexion lie outside our control. Individuals can project competence and warmth through thoughtful attire, poised demeanor, and friendly facial expressions. You'll understand and you'll agree with me that audience from rapid judgments based on appearances and strategic self-presentation then enhance credibility and fosters and kind of now openness to verbal contribution. So we need to, so there are certain things that we cannot do much about, but like if we can leave a positive impression with our way of sitting, with our way of dressing up, with our way of using some kind of properties, some stage props as they may call it, to influence the communication pattern. So that is important. I think that once we are talking about gestures, postures, tone, clothing, accessories, I think it is important that we look at paralanguage fundamentals at the same time. What are the voice qualities in meaning? Like paralanguage, if I talk about, it is about pitch, volume, rate, and quality, and like a certain kind of all verbal fillers, all of which like constitute spoken words and guide listeners towards speakers emotional and attitudinal state. Like for example, like if the phrase "I'm a good communicator," that will acquire different implications when stress fall on I, good, or communicator, illustrating how emphasis reshapes identical vocabulary. So you if you say if I say I go to hospital, I go to hospital, I go to hospital, like I mean that's how voice qualities will affect the sense of meaning embedded there. So if we look at the interpretation of tone, for example, a warm, steady tone suggests enthusiasm or agreement, while hesitant or monotone delivery signals doubt or disinterest, often outweighing literal sentence content. Like I'm basically building up a case of like we need to be familiar with paralanguage fundamentals, kind of identify this, that listeners evaluate credibility, intelligence from vocal cues. So conscious modulation of pace and inflection is essential for persuasive, clear communication. That is something that we need to kind of be very alert about, and we can use that day to day context, be it formal, be it informal. Like, I think when we are looking at this part, I think we can look at tone, pace, and voice signals. How kind of it may lead to emotional revolution. Like, the sound of a person's voice may reveal concealed feelings. Like, I'm fine in a flat tone alerts friends to underlying distress, despite, like, if if I'm not very chirpy and enthusiastic at the time of announcing my, like, I'm fine, then company people, your friends, they may get little alert about it, and then may say that, oh, perhaps there is something which needs to be done, like that. So vocal warmth can build up empathy, and whereas the harsh volume may unintentionally intimidate, and highlighting the need to align sounds with intentions. I am saying that we need to kind of interact, and we need to manage our interaction. My dear students, you will you will be glad to see that an effective speakers, they vary, they kind of improvise the speed to maintain interest, pause to invite reflection, and employ supportive noises such as like some sounds which encourage others contribution. So like vocal behavior structures, turn taking, prevent interruptions, and demonstrate active listening, thereby sustaining collaborative dialogue. This is something that we have to very, very clear, and kind of clearly absorb that in our understanding of non-verbal communication. If we kind of go to like the idea, when we have done discussion on proxemics, like, and special zones, I think if I give you a bit basic statistics, like Edward T. Hall, who is a famous anthropologist, like he has identified 4 zones, like intimate, personal, social, and beyond. Like, depending on the 1.5 feet, 1.5 to 4 feet, social is 4 to 12 feet, like each prescribing appropriate interaction types. So you'll have, like, in the context of family, the family affection typically occurs at intimate zone, casual conversation in the personal zone, formal negotiations in the social zone, and speeches in the public zone. So, like, I think that the meaning of distance has to be understood in this, where we, by choosing how close to stand, all communicators, signal familiarity, authority, or detachment. A kind of unwanted invasion of space can cause discomfort or perceived aggression. This is something that we'll understand, and take forward in our kind of orientation into this important course on soft skills, and then also how we will use sensitivity to proxemic expectations, prevent communication, especially in multicultural settings where acceptable distances, they differ significantly. Sometimes, like, if you are standing little far, that will communicate a little more complex thing, and we will have to kind of talk about changing that. As far as cultural variation in space use is concerned, I'm basically about emphasizing that we need to be familiar with cross-cultural contrast. Like, what is right in one cultural sense may not be the best thing in another cultural thing. So, like, high contact cultures may favor reduced personal distance and frequent touch, while low contact societies expect wider gaps and minimal physical contact during a piece of conversation. So, like, I think we'll take this and, like, look at how office layout, from open seating to private cabins, likewise reflect organization culture, signaling hierarchy or egalitarianism through kind of equal design. As far as adaptive strategies are concerned, I think we have discussed it in our course material at length, and it's about observing local norms, such as stepping back if a conversational partner retreats, and demonstrates respect, and promotes comfort, enhancing mutual understanding. So, if you find yourself in an uncertain condition, following the host culture's cue for distance, it will help you to avoid unintentionally intrusive or aloof behavior. So yes, I mean, our cultural variation in space use is important, and you will kind of orient yourself in that. Within our country, you will find that when we look at our country, which is like a microcosm of the whole world, you'll find that what is true so good in North India may not be all that same and there in South India or Western India, as food habits, for example, appreciation for uh, spices, and that may go for a bit of change. I'm building up to kind of point of view on the significance of non-verbal communication, and as to how we will use that to not just balance but perfect our communication uh, pattern, and achieve the desired success through that in our personal and professional life. I think when we are discussing about non-verbal communication, haptics is something very, very crucial. You have understood that already. When we touch somebody, it can convey affection, encouragement, dominance, or reassurance. Like if you meet a military person, he will kind of shake hands with you in a different way. So that to kind of project a little dominant approach and authority. So you include that in your understanding, like a firm handshake signaling confidence. We may discuss about Chronemics, which is about punctuality and perception. All studies on Chronomics study how individuals structure time, revealing traits such as reliability, urgency, and or status. Arriving early will suggest that you are very aligned with the vision and mission of an institution. You have respect for your colleagues, and a chronic lateness can signal a sense of disorganization. And in Western business context, you'll find out, you'll understand that they place high value on punctuality, and so we need to kind of be aware, and we need to orient ourselves accordingly. And if you look at the cultural flexibility, you have interpreting on time, depends on occasion, strict for interview, relaxed for parties, and demanding situational judgment to avoid offense. As far as efficient management of time in meetings and response projects, alert about that, that will project discipline and seriousness of purpose, reinforcing professional reputation. I think that if you look at sign language and symbolic system, we have discussed that at length in our study material. I think, friends, the idea of silence is very important. Expressive range, like for example, silence can signify multiple things at the same time, like sadness, anger, respect, contemplation, disagreement. And it will speak sometimes louder than your words. Sometimes your silence screams. So that, like, then you have to handle it. You have to be a little more strategic in terms of your pauses and silences in dialogue, which may convey reluctance and create urgency for the listener to respond and demonstrate thoughtful consideration before judgment. As far as if I'm not able to measure and kind of use my silence pattern, I think that it may cause a sense of misinterpretation, and the silence, it may suggest politeness and disapproval at the same time. Like depending on the contextual cultural cues, we need to kind of deal with that. As far as enhancing non-verbal awareness is concerned, like when you analyze yourself, assess yourself on a day-to-day basis, you can always hone those skills by attending to one's postures, facial attention, vocal tone, and other aspects that we have discussed. We have discussed, like if we like if you are aware of these things, will suggest more empathy, more will reduce more conflict and support. So I'm of the opinion that today's discussion on non-verbal communication will go a long way in foregrounding our communication pattern even more. We will connect in our next discussion. I hope you have enjoyed this discussion. If you have some questions, you can always write to me. I'll be very, very happy in responding to all your queries on this particular fold of communication. Thank you very much. Stay focused and make this course count for your all walks of life. Thank you very much.